right, we'll go ahead and get started. Many of you all know me. I am the chair of the Committee on the Environment with AIA Austin. And we also have my co-chair, Ashley Griswold, on the call. And Jaime Alvarez, he is our leader of our environmental justice subcommittee, who has worked really hard to put together a series for us this year. And this is the first part of the series. As always, we have to thank our sponsors. Can't do it without them, Indoor Weather Professionals, Pilgrim, and Hill and Wilkinson. And just as a reminder, as we typically do at the beginning of our events, we have several more events coming up. We're very busy, so want to remind you all. We have our next in our AIU series on resiliency and adaptation on June 17th. And then a session on transportation electrification and Project Connect on July 1st, a session on zero waste plan August 5th, and then the Austin Design Excellence Conference is happening August 18th through the 20th, and I believe registration will be opening soon. So I will hand it off to Jaime.
Yes, welcome. My name is Jaime Alvarez. I'm an architect at Nordic Sargent. My primary building interests are sustainability and historic preservation. If you've recently driven by the old federal courthouse around 8th Street in Colorado, you'll notice it got a significant facelift. That's my project for about 3 years. However, within the last year, I've started taking on a larger subject, environmental justice, for which we started a subcommittee here at COTE. This is the first of a 4-part series. Later events will take on the subject at the state level and then professional practice. We'll attempt to wrap up by coming back to housing affordability since it is such a critical topic now. Please bear with us as we set dates and the best speakers we can get. And as you'll see today, it's going to be worth the wait. And if you have any recommendations, I'll drop my email in the chat and you can send them along. We would like to start by defining environmental justice. When we think of this topic, I think we inherently think of environmental injustice, the struggles which historically brought the topic to the forefront. But what does environmental justice actually look like? At COTE, we're still learning, and we've come to the following. Environmental justice requires that all communities have access to high quality environmental and urban resources so that they may best pursue a fulfilling life with equity. Community amenities and burdens should be fairly distributed, never skewed to benefit one community to the detriment of another. This also demands access to the decision-making process. As we'll learn today, this has not always been the case and still tends to not be the case. Which communities are asked to take on unfavorable land uses, additional density, at-risk populations, and so on. Into this discussion, it's logical to introduce the question of housing. Given that access to housing one can afford, determines location and access to basic environmental resources, such as clean air, open space, parks, potable water, and healthy indoor environments. The issue of affordable housing is an environmental justice issue. This is a topic which a city with progressive affirmations, such as Austin, must address. It is within this context that I introduce our first speaker. We'll set aside the last 10 minutes for questions, and please also drop those into the chat. Our first speaker, Susana Almanza, has lived social and environmental justice history in Austin. Her group, Poder, has been at the forefront of these struggles for decades. If you ever heard of the infamously toxic tank farm, it was her group that finally got it shut down. She was most recently named to the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. And with that, I'll hand the screen to her. So you can take over, Susana.
Okay, let's see. So first of all, I want to thank Jaime and AIA Austin for giving me the opportunity to present today. My topic is zoning and land use, stopping the cycle of Austin's racist history. And you can see, we talk about racism, race prejudice plus institutional power equals the misuse of institutional and social power, a system of oppression maintained by institutions and cultural norms that exploit, control, and oppress people of color groups in order to maintain a position of social and material supremacy and privilege for white people, particularly the powerful and the wealthy elite.
Have you started sharing the screen, Susana?
Sorry?
Have you started sharing the screen? Because I see your video, but I don't see your slides.
Oh, you don't see the slides?
No, no, if you can.
Oh, I'm sharing. Okay, let me go back.
Okay.
Should be the green button at the bottom
Yeah.
of your screen.
Yeah, I thought I was on there already.
Okay. Here it is.
Uh-huh.
Now you can see.
All right.
Yes.
Okay, great,
Here we go.
great.
Excellent.
Okay. Okay. Austin's zoning and land use code is rooted in a history of racism and has fostered the wealth, security, and safety of Austin's affluent and middle-class white residents while failing to provide the same for our communities of color. It has served in the interest of the developers, the Chamber of Commerce, Austin Real Estate Council, Austin Board of Realtors, and Home Builders Association of Greater Austin, while leaving Austin's neighborhoods of color with flooding, unsafe streets, inadequate access to healthy food, inadequately funded schools, substandard housing, and ultimately gentrification. The 13th Amendment, adopted immediately after the Civil War, prohibits slavery or, in general, treating African Americans as second-class citizens, while the 14th Amendment prohibits states or their local government from treating people either unfairly and unequally. From the 1870s until the 1920s, Blacks and Mexicans were forced to move into settlements outside of what was then the city of Austin into communities such as Clarkville, St. John's, and Montopolis. In 1922, Congress passed the Standard State Zoning Enabling Act. This act cleared the path for cities to create their master plans and segregate cities throughout the United States. The city of Austin created the 1928 master plan and began to relocate African Americans living in Wheatsville and Clarksville, known as Freedmen towns, dating back to the 1870s in West Austin. Since Austin knew that using zoning could bring about a constitutional challenge, they created other policies to displace communities of color to East Austin. The city closed the segregated Black schools, libraries, and parks in West Austin to force a relocation of Blacks to East Austin. The city built new segregated schools, libraries, and parks in Rosewood Courts. The all-Black public housing project in East Austin, the city helped develop the Negro District. From the 1870s and 1940, Mexican-American families were concentrated in a neighborhood southwest of downtown and remained downtown through the 1940s. The completion of the Tom Miller and the Longhorn Dam that protected the city from major floods raised the land values and thus began the displacement of the Mexican-American community from downtown to segregated East Austin. Other policies such as deed restrictions and city ordinances prohibit both Mexican and African Americans from buying or renting homes anywhere outside of East Austin. The 1957 Industrial Development Plan allowed the Planning Commission to zone all property in East Austin industrial, including single-family residential uses. Under cumulative zoning, residential homes could be built on land zoned industrial. Cumulative zoning allowed polluting facilities and other hazardous facilities to be built adjacent to residential homes and schools in East Austin. West Austin was protected from cumulative zoning. In 1956, Highway Act was used to segregate and displace communities of color throughout the United States. In Austin, Highway 35 created the clearest physical barrier between East Austin and the rest of the city, deepening the racial segregation. Melpac was another highway used to displace the remaining African Americans in West Austin. Another gentrification tool in the 1960s through the 1970s was the urban renewal program known as urban removal to communities of color. The city of Austin instituted this program to use eminent domain to steal the land owned by people of color in East Austin. The East Cesar Chavez neighborhood plan, located east of Highway 35, was adopted in May 1999. This plan opened the floodgates to gentrification. Residents in the areas have experienced a rapid escalation in appraised property values. According to a UT study, area residents in single-family homes experienced over a 400% plus increase in land value and 123% increase in their tax bill from 1998 to 2004. The Austin City Council adopted the East Riverside Corridor Master Plan in 2010 and adopted new design and zoning regulations in 2013. The council adopted the plan as if Riverside Drive was vacant of human life. Over 1,700 low-income and working class people, mostly people of color, were displaced to make room for the new higher density, high-class wage earners. Looking at demolitions in East Austin, East Austin composed of zip code 78702, 78721, 22, 23, 41, and 44, has been overall increase in residential issued since 2019. And you can see in the zip code 78702, there was a 35% increase of residential demolition permits issued after the single member district council took power in 2015 to 2019. Also 111 increase in 7821, 17% increase in 782022, zip code 78722, and 63% increase in 78723, and 17% increase in 78741, and a 154% increase in 78744. So the demolition of family homes and being replaced with luxury and unaffordable housing increase the property taxes for the people living in those areas. And then we looked at the increase in taxes by looking at the tax paid in homes in 2020 versus 2016. We can see that in 7841 and 78722, 2321, and 02, the taxes paid increased by 48% for 56% for the demolished homes. For the other 43% of demolished homes, the taxes more than doubled as multiple properties were built on the same lot. Demolished homes had an average of 45% property value increase. And here are some of the things that COTE has worked on: community workshops on land use and zoning. We had to inform and educate our community on how land use and zoning work. We had to translate the whole City of Austin land zoning codes. At that time, nothing was bilingual. We established and registered neighborhood associations, creating past ordinance, the East Austin overlays, also moratoriums. We rezoned over 600 incompatibly zoned properties in residential areas. We relocated some of the most hazardous facilities that included the tank farm, the BFI, the Holly power plant, and pure casting. COTE's Young Scholars for Justice Leadership Development Program has been ongoing since 1995. And COTE had a radio show for 10 years on Radio Co-op Weekly. We've increased community engagement in City of Austin's neighborhood contact teams. We created the People's Plan, looking for policy development, preserving historic Negro School in Montapas, preserving the land that is now Oak Springs Preserve, and worked on the comprehensive plan for the Roy Guerrero Park. We've participated on boards and commission. Through our work, we've helped establish a lot of different task force, gentrification, displacement, environmental racism, etc. We've worked on several reports: the drainage fee and capital improvement and equity in City of Austin, the demolition report, the gentrification timeline. COTE Next contributed to the legacy of Austin's racism and land development planning, the People's Plan, racism in East Austin, East Riverside Corridor Master Plan, produces white immigration, and much more. And so we've been really busy on trying to bring justice and trying to address the legacy, the historic racist legacy that the City of Austin was built on. Thank you.
Thank you, Susana, for that very comprehensive introduction to our history that maybe a lot of us weren't familiar with. And now we can get to our second speaker, Sara Bronin. She has an extensive resume. She's a Mexican-American architect. She's educated at UT, Yale, Oxford, attorney, professor, and a lead in the Desegregate Connecticut effort. And if that's not enough, she's writing a book too. And from here, Sara, the screen is yours.
Great, thank you. So thank you so much for inviting me. I went to school at UT Austin, so I'm familiar with Austin. But I also wanted to point out, back in 2006, I was the managing editor of what was then the Next American City magazine. And I was reading this story, which is about preservation in the progressive city, historic preservation and gentrification. And again, back in 2006. And half of the story is about Poder and Susana. So anyway, I've been following your career for and your work in Austin for many years, and I appreciate and respect everything that you've been doing. So I just got out of a presentation at the the California Preservation Foundation. And as you can tell by the name, that group is a group of preservationists. And so thinking about this conversation in light of that conversation is really interesting. So I hope we can get into those questions in the Q&A. But really for my presentation, I might skip over some of the slides that they might be repetitive of what we just heard. But the question that I really want to address is, what does zoning have to do with environmental justice? And maybe zooming out a bit from Austin to talk about some of the things we've observed in the Connecticut experience, and also just general links between zoning and environmental issues. And my perspective today is really informed by the past year of coalition building for a group called Desegregate Connecticut, which includes 70 different coalitions, and there's our website and Twitter account there. And actually, I'll skip to the coalition page first. 70 different members, affordable housing advocates, social justice advocates. And I just want to mention the AIA of Connecticut and as being one of the major partners in our effort. And essentially, we are a group that has looked at Connecticut's zoning laws and come to the very similar conclusion as to what Susana has just described, which is that zoning laws have discriminatory effects. And there is such a thing as good zoning, and we should work toward that goal as opposed to what we have. There are lots of different reasons why zoning is important. There are equity reasons which motivated us to really get together and push for the statewide legislation that just passed. I'm really glad to say last week, both houses of the legislature. And so again, most of us were motivated by equity. There are economic reasons to rezone, to create a more inclusive economy. And there are, of course, environmental reasons. So I'm going to focus today on some of those environmental reasons. But just stepping back, I mean, Connecticut and really all over the country, you can see in President Biden's agenda, there's a growing recognition that zoning does lead to inequality, the things that Susana's been working on for decades now. At the same time, there's a growing recognition that we have a warming planet, that we have, that climate change is real. I know you can't say that all the time in Texas, but certainly we can up here on the East Coast. We have entire units of Yukon working on climate resilience and adaptation. So we recognize up here that we have that. So you put two and two together, and you really have started to see over the last few years a growing recognition that when we zone in restrictive ways, when we zone in ways that exclude people of color, exclude low-income people from communities, a lot of those same practices go hand in hand with environmental destruction and lead to sprawl, lead to increased use of transportation, the use of cars, lead to inefficient, energy inefficient patterns of development. So what we see here in Connecticut and of course in Austin too, you see a lot of single family zoning, a lot of large lot zoning, you see minimum unit sizes, you see basically land use patterns generally that lock in the kind of development that is difficult for low-income people to access, and also just problematic from an environmental perspective. In zip codes with restrictive zoning, you see carbon impacts of 2 times or more. And so who are these highways that Susana was talking about serving? they're serving people who are driving, they're serving people who own cars, and those people who own cars are driving through communities, low-income communities, communities of color that were destroyed to make the highways that serve the people who are in a place of privilege. So they are going out to their ex-urban communities, and we're talking about Austin now as really a region, and they're polluting the central cities. There are a lot, and I'm just going to go through a few slides, a lot of different studies about zoning and walkability. Manhattan and Brooklyn here in the green, the use of the car, the fact that those households have fewer cars leads to fewer greenhouse gas emissions per person as opposed to the outerlying areas. You see two studies that have been done on different types of developments, suburban versus all the way down to green urban at the bottom, and their carbon usage. Transportation emissions are distinctly tied to land use patterns. You see Atlanta on the left with a population of 5 million, how much land it uses, and then at the bottom, how much carbon emissions, 6.9 tons versus 1.16 tons of Barcelona with the same population. And again, these are just meant to be evocative slides, and we can get into details as needed. Here's a very similar slide to 2 slides ago, but this is talking about the energy use of different kinds of structures, and the fact that when we have suburban sprawl, you're using not just more transportation energy, but you're using all kinds of other energy. That housing for every unit of housing, it's more than if you live in a more compact urban location. And then again, the New York Times has done lots of studies showing where housing emissions how housing emissions relates to transportation, zoning relates to transportation emissions. And you can see that again, New York is one example, but even Washington, DC, Arlington, Texas being very zoned for single family, which is the pink, and having pretty high transportation related emissions. Because anytime that you have to get in your car, anytime your community is built for people in cars as opposed to people who are walking, biking, or using public transit, you're creating a city that is going to result in more transportation emissions. Oregon Portland is one place where an urban growth boundary has been used as a solution. Austin doesn't have that luxury anymore because of all of the development that's happened in places outlying the city. So that's kind of, I'm going to skip this slide on Philadelphia. In Connecticut, we found that the kind of zoning that we have has resulted in a lot of sprawl out into our wooded areas, our farmland. It's again not exactly the same issue within the city of Austin, but outside of the city when you're looking at Buda, when you're looking at some of the smaller communities that have really exploded in population. Again, those are many of those people are commuting into Austin and bringing their transportation emissions into the city. This has really changed over time. And actually, I'm going to skip this slide too, because it sort of reinforces the point. So zoning also relates to equity. The way that we zone in Connecticut has resulted in a vast segregation. We are known as one of the most segregated places in the country. Our central cities, I live in one of them, it's Hartford. Hartford is actually 15% white, 85% everything else, including myself. I'm Mexican American, but the surrounding suburbs are as much as 95% white. So you go from 15 to 95% just from one community to the next. And that's not just true for Hartford, it's true for the New Haven, Bridgeport, and to some extent Stamford areas. So okay, so as part of Desegregate Connecticut, and I don't want to take up too much time on our specific proposals, but we had a range of proposals that related to equity, environment, and inclusive economic development. And what we focused on was trying to create opportunities for more diverse housing than we had. I think it's in the next slide. So right now, 90.6% of Connecticut is zoned for single family housing. We know that because we did a study using the Connecticut zoning, it's called the Connecticut Zoning Atlas. It's at desegregate.org/atlas, which showed that, again, all of the purple, this is Connecticut, all of the purple is single family zoning. About half of that land is zoned for 2-acre minimum lot sizes. By contrast, only 2.3 allows for multifamily housing as of right, which means without any restrictive special permits. I say that we have been zoning by 1,000 cuts in Connecticut. We have minimum lot sizes, minimum unit sizes, minimum parking requirements, restrictions on accessory dwelling units. So we do have a lot of communities that say they allow them, but very few communities that allow them without really onerous requirements. So accessory dwellings are the kind of small units of housing that are built on the same lot as a single family zone. We also see minimum parking requirements, and here's a community, New Haven, one of our central cities, where minimum parking requirements have resulted in this sort of half-empty lot where housing could have been built, but instead, for that building next door, this lot has to stay open and kind of blighted and unattractive on a corner in a bustling neighborhood that can't be used for housing. And so when you're requiring parking, that means you're not allowing housing to be built. And in general, the more housing that is built, the better off everybody is, because it's sort of an economics 101 problem, which is the more supply you have, the lower the prices are. So there is a tension there between some people who, in certain neighborhoods, more housing may be viewed as a negative. And in fact, it is viewed as a negative in all of those communities across Connecticut that require single family only zoning. But even in central cities, some people say, well, we shouldn't be allowing more housing. We should just, sort of lock in what is. But studies have shown, and especially recent research has shown, that the more supply you have, the better off, in fact, low-income people within communities are, because they have more choices as to what they can live in. Parking has also been a huge issue for cities like Hartford. On the left, you see our downtown in 1957, at the dawn of the automobile era. The red shows where parking lots are. And then on the right, you see how much of a much bigger percentage of our downtown it is. Combination of parking requirements and lack of investment, destruction at the highways, 84, which is now kind of curling around the city, destroying huge amounts of 1 to 3 story buildings, and leading to a pretty, well, I guess you could say an opportunity here in Hartford for more growth. In fact, we have rezoned to allow for those parking lots to turn into a variety of uses. So I'm going to stop there, kind of giving you some highlights as to the link between zoning and environmental justice, some specific strategies or tactics that we've looked at, and kind of some overarching principles as to how zoning can be improved to create both greater equity and also a more sustainable environment. And so I'll look forward to questions and comments.
Okay. And I'll start off with one question for both of our speakers, and then I hope we can have some questions from the audience. Anything you'd like to ask? So I'll start off. Per the Austin Board of Realtors April data, the city of Austin reported a median home price of $550,000. This is an all-time high, and it keeps going up. There's an inventory low of 0.6 months, and this is a trend that goes back to December. So by all accounts, there's an affordable housing crisis in the city. As we've mentioned here, it's pushing working class citizens farther away from their work. They're condemned to traffic and lesser resources than they find in the urban core. So I think this is fundamentally inequitable. And this is not a trend that's exclusive to Austin. And then to complicate this, homeowners in places where change is proposed, they usually speak loudly against it. Renters, rarely do we hear from them. So I just wanted to ask broadly to the both of you, what is it going to take for housing reform to finally happen, not just in Austin, but I guess in the country overall? What do we need to do to get engagement from all residents? And are there any successful examples you can think of? I mean, do we have, is there hope?
Well, I'm chime in. I think it's going to take federal policy because what's happening now, if you look across the United States, even with with HUD and the money that goes into the cities, what they're doing is they're renting at 60% median family income, and ownership is at 80% median income. That's an inequity right there. So what is happening is that even the cities are using federal money to gentrify our communities. So they're building these townhomes and other types of homes in our communities and calling it low income. When you look at the census data, we live at 30 to 40% median family income. So even though they're building ownership homes in our neighborhood, we can't afford to live in them. And even though they're building rental properties, we can't afford to get into them either. So I think it's going to be federal policy lowering the median family income to go from 30, 40, or 50 so that it changes the whole policy of the housing that we're building that will really serve the people. The other thing is that we have to make sure that we're building homes for families because there comes the economic impact. What had happened is here in Austin, five of the schools are going to be closed and more in the future because of the low population rate in the schools. And that is due to gentrification. So when you displace families and you make homes unaffordable, it impacts the schools also. It impacts all the different restaurants that serve, families, everything that's family based gets impacted, even the religious institutions because now you find that the churches are having to buy and more lots just for parking because everybody has to drive in. You can no longer even walk to your local churches. The other thing I think is that we need to build more public housing. I mean, we have not built public housing here in Austin since the late 30s. And so here again, we're not servicing the poor, the extremely poor, the people who are living in very fixed income. And so I think that we have to look at a lot of the federal policies and what they're doing and bring it down. But also, we've been saying for decades that the city needs to use public land to build housing. The city owns thousands of properties, whether it stole them, eminent domain, it bought them, it confiscated, all kinds of ways that it acquired these lands. And that's where the cost of building housing comes in, is when you don't own the land. But if we, the city, own the land, there's no reason we should not be building housing. And there's no reason we shouldn't be doing partnerships. And one of the examples I'll give is the Guadalupe Neighborhood Corporation. That corporation has been building homes, low income, affordable, also ownership, and now rental. And it's been building it for families. And it is the only housing corporation that has the right to return policy. So if you were displaced, you get on a priority list that when they build housing, you get access to that housing. And so that's something that we were trying to push the right to return policy here in Austin, and it got it got there, but it's not completely adopted yet. But I think all of these different policies that we need to work on and that we need to use public land and that we need to address federal policies are a lot of the answers to a lot of the housing deficiencies, especially for the poor and the working poor.
Yeah, I kind of feel a lot of that. I'm not sure if I'm echoing, but literally echoing, but I echo a lot of that. And, thinking about the federal approach, I think that we have an opportunity right now. There's a focus from the Biden administration on zoning. I do worry about the proposal to provide financial incentives to communities to make their zoning less exclusive, because I think it's going to be really hard to develop a formula to assess that. So I know that there's plenty of smart people in DC, and I'm hoping that you know, that people really focus on how to measure that. I also do think you asked about examples. So in addition to the examples from Austin, you know, here in Hartford, when we redid our zoning plan at the local level, when we redid our city plan and our climate action plan, all in the last 8 years or so, and I was chair of the commission, we really made an effort to go out to people who'd never talked or thought about zoning before. We went to school groups, we went to senior citizen centers, both of the senior citizen centers in the city. We went to groups which Main Street type business associations, which are not the big chamber of commerce, but really the neighborhood business associations that in Hartford are predominantly run by people of color. So we really tried to reach out to a lot of different people. But I think that planners and zoning commissioners have an obligation to be proactive and not just sort of have a community meeting downtown and say, okay, everybody who wants to talk about zoning, come to my meeting. You kind of have to explain to people what zoning is, why it matters, and what it can do for them, and ask them, well, you know, if these are the broad principles, what would you like for it to do for you? What would you like to change in your neighborhood, or what would you like to stay the same? What we heard in a lot of those meetings was very, there was, when we did the zoning effort, we completely threw out the old zoning code because it was incredibly terrible. And we wrote a whole new one, and it passed unanimously. It passed in one night. And I think part of the reason for that was because we did all of that outreach, and we really tried to respond and listen to people who were here, while at the same time envisioning what kind of city Hartford could be for future residents. So trying also to balance what future residents could be. Unlike Austin, Hartford is a declining city. It used to have 200,000 people. It has 125,000 people. And as you saw, lots of our downtown is surface parking lots. So we kind of have the opposite problem, where you're facing a lot of development pressure. Hartford is facing pressure to develop, or else it won't really survive and thrive. But I think some of the principles are the same, which is really robust outreach on people's own terms, in order to try to come to solutions. I mean, Austin's rezoning has been terribly fraught for many years. Something needs to change with zoning, and hopefully in the next couple of years there will be a better consensus as to how to do that. But I think people want to change. They know it's not right, and I think the question is just how. Oh, I just want to say one more thing too, and I queued up a chat linked about it, which is Susana brought up schools, and this idea that we are zoning for young professionals, that we're zoning for single people, is absolutely crazy to me. I have 3 kids. I think that we have such a culture that's unfriendly to children. Here in Connecticut, we see zoning board after zoning board, people, existing homeowners getting up and saying, but how many kids is this project going to bring to our community? In a state where the population is declining, again, unlike Texas, but really anywhere, we should be embracing children. We should be embracing families. We should be hoping that we're building communities that young families and young kids want to be a part of, and is welcoming to them. This idea of these apartment buildings will be a burden on the community is so, it's so outrageous to me. It's just fundamentally outrageous, but it's also proven from data and research to be false. We've seen studies of Connecticut apartment buildings that produce more tax revenue than they demand in terms of school services and other services. It's just a totally false and provably false fear, this fear of kids. So I think that that's something that needs to be completely reversed in the way that we think about zoning, because it's really the kids that make a community complete. You can't just have a community full of singles. I mean, with all due respect to singles, my sister is a single who lives in Austin. So with all due respect to her, but you know, it's a very perverse the way that we use zoning as a weapon against families.
Sarah, would you mind mentioning a little bit, maybe some of the objections you faced or obstacles in your work?
So the schools is one of them. You know, if you rezone to allow anything other than single family housing, how are we going to pay for these people? False fears about crime. And I'm not saying that I'm not trying to diminish people's concerns or fears about new kinds of zoning. What I'm trying to say is that the data proves that those fears are unfounded. So the idea that 2-family, 3-family, 4-family or more housing necessarily brings crime to communities, that it detracts from property values. In fact, we've seen the opposite. When somebody's able to put an accessory dwelling unit on their home, it allows for them to benefit. It allows for by increased property values, but it also gives them that income stream that they need to help upkeep their house, and would have allowed for more flexibility in some of the situations where you see tear downs in Austin, because people don't think that they can stay in their homes because there's not a financial mechanism for them to do that. But making living there more flexible by allowing accessory dwelling units is one way to do that. But again, we've seen a lot of concern about the fact that anything other than single family housing is going to hurt our property values. We've also seen the false fear that that zoning will lead to that more housing will lead to environmental degradation. But the truth is that if you build more housing, if you create walkable communities in smart places around our train stations, for example, many of which in Connecticut have 2-acre minimum zoning around a train station, which just from a land use perspective is totally inefficient, but from an environmental perspective is backwards too, because you're pushing one unit of housing further and further out, and you're making that train station, which could be the place where you have development close in, where you're creating a walkable community where people can hop on the train and get where they need to go. You're making that impossible. So zoning for more housing in the right places is actually much better for the environment. And the way that we zone now, at least in Connecticut, is much, much worse. It's terrible for the environment. So that FAQs page can help with that.
Okay. How do we get our more affluent communities to sometimes get on board with, say, there's oftentimes objections of having higher density housing in their communities, affordable housing in their communities. And as Susana pointed out in her presentations, oftentimes places like East Austin are easily targeted for significant amounts of growth, potentially because there's less objection from these communities because they don't have as strong a voice. So how do we get the more affluent, I'd say, on board and help us out with this? And I'll open that up to the both of you. Do you want to go, Susan?
Well, I just think I wanted to touch back on that accessory unit, because one of the things we brought up, because I think we have to be really careful when we say, if we allow the people to build a second unit on their property, this is going to help sustain them. And when we looked at the cost of building that second unit, it was $110,000. And so what we recommended to the council was that you need to get forgivable loans, or you have to do low interest loans, because poor people or working class people that do have homes, and we have to remember that we're not on big lots too, but also that's our mobility, our assets. We were forced to live in East Austin. We built the houses from $2,000 to $8,000, and they're now valued, over $300,000 at least, the land. But that was the only asset that really had the mobility power for the Mexican American community and the African American community to continue, right, and provide for our families. And so, yes, a secondary unit would be helpful, but if you don't have the money and you can't pay the loan, it's not helpful at all. So it's not always good to come up with these suggestions unless you have also, how do we make them really viable? Do we provide forgivable loans? Do we provide low interest loans so they can build that secondary unit? So I think we don't go far enough when we talk about these alternatives. we don't think about, well, how does that happen? Because what happened was then we started getting all the gentrifiers coming in, buying properties and building 2 to 4 houses on the lot. Of course, they had the access, they had the funding, and then it impacted the property taxes for everybody else living around there. And then again, that was another economic, I call it economic racism, because it was another way of taxing them out of our homes and the land. And so I think that we really need to think about this and not look down on the single family home, especially you can't do a broad brush kind of thing, because when you look at throughout the United States in the segregation, people of color own their homes. In Holly's, the Mexican American community had 67% ownership. They're down to 20% ownership now. So when you look at all these different pockets, even Montopolis, and you see what's really happening, it's a big land grab going on in our place where nobody once wanted to cross over. Is now everybody's coming over, and now, like you say, we're the prime targets. And because we don't have the lawyers and we don't have the economic background, the players, everybody to go fight it right away, it becomes a battle where we have to use valid petitions, we have to be constantly organizing, and this is all on volunteer basis and stuff, of just trying to sustain ourselves in place. You know, that's a big struggle of just trying to sustain ourselves in place. And we have now worked with the white allies in West Austin, who are now also looking at, yes, there is a lot of racist land use policies, and how do we address it and work it? And they've actually been helping us on trying to sustain us in place, because right now we're under siege with developers coming in and really putting a lot of pressure, and then building these homes and raising up the taxes. But I think she's right that the making the allies with people in West Austin and understanding what their plight is, but also what our plight, and how they have been able to garner a lot of privileges. That's why we came up with the People's Plan, and we said we need the neighborhood combining districts that West Austin always had, because it protected their single family house. And not only that, it gave them the opportunity to say, well, do we let this duplex in? Do we need to let this triplex or this multifamily plex in? And that's how they were able to control their neighborhood and sustain themselves, versus East Austin didn't have the same zoning protections as the rest of Austin. So that's why I say we can't do broad stroke, because in all these communities, it's a very different story when it comes to communities of colors in all the different states and the cities. They're living probably more the reality that East Austin is living, versus other places where there wasn't mass segregation.
Good points.
And let's see. We have a question. We have two questions here from Kendall. And she's asking, how can we bring back what we've lost due to gentrification? Is there anything we can do? Can we? And do you want to take it, Susana?
Yeah, like I said, we can do the People's Plan. We put together 6 resolutions that looked at one is putting together a community public land trust, because we do have a public land trust here, but the thing is that we would like to have one run by the community, and one that doesn't have the federal mandate that you can't let very low income people, and one that's managed by actually people of color and low income people, which we think is different. We also said when they did a bond, a certain percentage of that bond money needed to go automatically to affordable housing. So what keeps happening is Austin, we passed a 250 million affordable housing bond money, and it's being used indiscriminatory. And there's no real transparency on how that money is being spent. Now we just allocated 300 million for displacement. And Austin put in together an equity committee to put together equity tools of how that 300 million displacement money. The council then took 23 million out of that 300 million for land purchase. And we said, wait a minute, the equity tool is not even in place. So again, here is Austin that has come up with, these different task force on institutional racism. We did the UT report on uprooted, looking at displacement. We looked at the gentrification displacement task force, look at the housing blueprint, and they have all these recommendations, but you have a council that doesn't even abide by the recommendations or doesn't even abide by its own policies and saying, okay, we're going to have an equity committee, then come up with the equity tools in distributing that 300 million, and they go ahead and allocate 23 without the equity committee. They hadn't even finished the tools. And so we see a lot of this double talk when it comes to Austin. When we look at, we're once the city that has 54 neighborhood planning areas, and where we all came up exactly what where Sarah was saying, where the community decided what would be built there, what would they like to see. Of course, in East Austin, we had a lot of things pushed down and forced on us, even if we didn't want it included in our plan. But what happened was that East Riverside corridor then came through. It was a master plan, but we had our neighborhood plan. It had to come through Metropolis. And according to the city, the contact team has a right to review the zoning and participate. But they said we didn't have that right because that was a master plan and it trumped our neighborhood plan. So when you talk about community engagement and what the frustration that low income and working class people undergo, is we could spend years dedicating ourselves on making these plans and designing how we feel our community should look at, and then they're not adhered to. And then the city decides they want another plan. And so it becomes the master, you notice, master. So the master plan comes over the neighborhood and it says, well, you don't have a say in it because it is a master plan and we're going to go through your community, but you have no zoning rights on it. And that's how they upscale our community. And now we're facing major displacement in the one community that the UT uprooted report said, if there's anyone you can save, it should be the Montapas community. That's where you have still a majority of people of color, where you have 33% of the people living in poverty. In this community, Cesar Chavez community, forget it, it's been gentrified. Holly has been gentrified. Go Valley Johnson is getting there, but Montapas, you can still save them. That was 2018. We're now 2021 and nothing has happened. And so I think it's the policy people, the people that make the policies, the people in power who are not doing the equitable thing, that are not really respecting working class people and communities of color. And that's why I say racism is still very much alive in our zoning policies and within the cities.
Okay, we have a few more minutes left, and I wanted to ask one more question. Sarah, you have an architect background, and this is primarily this is an AIA group. So I wanted to ask, what role can design professionals play in all of this and improving, how can we tackle the issues of environmental justice, equity as design professionals? Do we need to get out of the office more? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I taught a class at the Yale School of Architecture this last semester, and this was the exact topic of my class. It was, what do you as architects need to know about zoning and how can you go about changing it? And I really enjoyed that conversation. And really what I told them is what the same thing I'll tell you guys, which is we as architects, we don't have an ethical code like doctors or even the AICP planners do. We just sort of, we're out in the world and just expected to design stuff. But that really, we underserve our collective communities by simply thinking of ourselves as designers. we really have to start, and hopefully the architects that came out of that class, and my law students and people who worked at AIA Connecticut and the planners who were on our team for Desegregate Connecticut are all kind of realizing, okay, it's on them. It's up to them to say, I'm an architect. I can roughly read a zoning code. I can see what it produces. I see Kendall's comment about not working for single family, working in the single family residential area anymore. Architects know way more about the land use system and its effects than almost any other professional group. And I think hopefully, as more and more architects become involved in social justice, involved in environmental justice issues, and more just aware of the links between zoning, between historic preservation, between racial covenants, between all of these sort of legal structures within which they work, that they'll be much more able and ready to use the knowledge that they have to change it and to work for good. I actually really believe that zoning can be used for good. I hope that we've done that here in Hartford in the way that we've zoned here locally. And I hope that Connecticut is moving in that direction with our statewide legislation. And as Susana says, there's a lot more that needs to be done than just zoning. There's financing, there's all kinds of related issues, but you have to start somewhere. And I think that architects should really be ready to take the first step to start engaging their own communities, their families, their firms, and really take a much more active role in the land use process and shaping it than they do. Because right now, lots of architects say, I've got clients, I'm not going to rock the boat here, but it's time for us to do that, just like it's time for lawyers to do that too.
Okay. Thank you. So that takes us to time, and then we can wrap up. So once again, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us and giving us an hour of your evening. These are, of course, very complicated issues. If they were easy, they would have already been solved and we wouldn't be talking about them today. But as Sarah has emphasized right now, they do require our attention, and it's time for us to get a little bit out of our comfort zone. So please join us for the next event, which will take on the topic a more traditional way at the state level. We'll announce date and speaker soon, and we're trying to put something together really good. And unless Kendall has anything to close us out with, I think we can wrap up.
Nope, just thank you guys for joining us. We really appreciated your company and hope we can stay connected.
Okay. Thank you to everybody.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Everybody who joined us, and please have a good night. Thank you. Bye.
Hey, Ashley.